Welcome to the session 30 Charities Later, presented by Savoie. We're specifically diving into the patterns that predict the success or failure of new projects. A little bit about Joy before I hand it over. Joy works on high-level strategy across all departments and mentorship and training for the participants of the incubation programs. He's also one of the primary contributors to the handbook, How to Start a High-Impact Nonprofit, which I highly recommend. Prior to charity entrepreneurship, he co-founded Charity Science, a meta-organization that increased the amount of counterfactual funding going to high-impact charities. Subsequently, he co-founded Charity Science Health, a nonprofit that increases vaccination rates in India using mobile phones and behavioral nudges. He's given lectures on various aspects of charity entrepreneurship and effective altruism in Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, EAG London, EAG San Francisco, Berlin, Vancouver, Stockholm, and many other places. Just a quick reminder before I hand it over to Joy, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them into the swap card, into the live discussion, and we'll pick it up in the Q&A session. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Joy on stage.
Thank you. All right. So, 30 charities later, what are the patterns that predict success or failure of new projects? We're going to try to cover it in 30 minutes, and we'll see how we do. But before I dive into that, I want to talk about my biggest life regret, just to start on a cheery note. So I was in college, about halfway through, and I decided that I was going to drop out after much thinking and humming and hawing on it. And it connects very deeply to my biggest life regret. I really think I should have dropped out sooner. I was available to do higher impact work. I was excited. I had job offers to do what I really wanted to do after school. I didn't really need the degree, and the training wasn't that useful. But I think I was implicitly waiting for permission. I was waiting for someone to tell me that I was ready or credentialed enough or important enough to actually make a difference in the world. And although I don't think dropping out is the right call for everybody, or even the majority of people, I do think a lot of people are kind of waiting for this call to action. They're waiting for the wise old wizard to kind of knock on their door and say, hey, you specifically, you have to go save the world. This is the closest thing you're going to get to that. We need more founders. That's the biggest difference that leads to fantastic charities getting started. Speaking of fantastic charities, let's talk a little bit about our sample size here. We have 27 incubated charities, 5 incubated foundations, and they've done a lot of really fantastic things. It's kind of grown over the years. We're now running 2 programs a year, and we're probably going to have about 10 charities founded every single year. But one thing that's a lot harder to see on this graph is the charities that weren't founded. It wasn't like charity entrepreneurship suddenly became a viable career path in 2019. There was actually great opportunities, possibly talented founders that just weren't connected to each other, that weren't founding great charitable organizations. Similarly, it's hard to notice an organization that doesn't get founded, doesn't get started, and what impact is lost there. In fact, you probably didn't even notice that one of our charities disappeared between these 2 slides. Lack of evidence is really hard to notice when it's not kind of right in front of you. And charities can have a truly massive impact. You know, they don't pop out of the ground. We need talented founders who kind of go through a program and start this. You've heard about quite a few of these charities before throughout this conference, but I want to highlight a couple that are doing fantastically well. So Family Empowerment Media, one of the top charities working on family planning. They've reached over 15 million listeners across a number of states in Nigeria. And the best guess of cost effectiveness is between 26 and actually 60 times Give Directly. So this is really one of the most cost-effective charities on the planet. And it really wouldn't have existed. It wouldn't have started up if not for a couple talented founders. Founders who actually first found out about charity entrepreneurship from a conference very similar to this. Let's switch cause areas and look at the Fish Welfare Initiative. They've helped over 1 million fish and 1 million shrimp as well. And they're working with 89 different farms, trying to constantly improve welfare standards. They're an ACE standout charity and Open Field recommended. They're one of the top field-leading charities. And these are the charities that we're really, really excited about. These field-leading charities can make a huge difference and have a massive impact. It's actually a bit weird that we have as many success stories as we do. Given that charity entrepreneurship is a relatively young org, a lot of our organizations are under 3 years old, and yet some of them have kind of grown to these fantastic rates. When you look at other incubators in the for-profit space or other nonprofit incubators, the survival curve is a lot less exciting, a lot less enthusiastic. Part of this is just by virtue of how the organizations or kind of broader ecosystems work. In general, the for-profit field is a lot more competitive. There's a lot of people who want to start something that makes the most money. There's a lot less people trying to start something that has the most impact. But even if we narrow it down to the charity sector, a lot of these charity entrepreneurship charities have done really, really well. And I wanted to dig in today to the patterns of why. What's really different between CE charities versus other charities on the market? And then furthermore, what's the difference between CE charities within each other that really leads to the top performers? So let's take a moment to look at the standard charity founding process. What's kind of the default output of the market? Well, in terms of career area, no one's really studying charity entrepreneurship. No one's really kind of practicing up in it. A lot of the time people fall into it coincidentally because they get access to a problem and see that there's no organization who's working on the solution for it. Similar thing with the charity idea. It's rare that it's backed with rigorous research. A lot of the time it's about circumstantial aspects, people bumping into the right problem at the right time. Co-founder, a lot of people are limited to their local network. Again, not a lot of incubators in the charity space, and of the very small pool of people who want to consider entrepreneurship, an even smaller pool of them want to consider charity entrepreneurship. So it's tough to find a great founder. And country is often just the one that people happen to be born in or happen to be visiting when they first got access to the problem. This methodology, in some ways, leads to somewhat predictable results. A few fantastic charities, a lot of charities that aren't having the maximum impact they can. CE does two things quite differently from this. The first thing is we're really explicit in the goal to maximize impact. That is the plan, and we do think that the top most impactful charities are kind of disproportionately important to get founded. And we also try to remove barriers to make it easier for someone who might not have the networks, might not have the co-founder, might not have 2 years to do research to find the best idea. Let's look at these 4 C's again, but with impact maximization in mind and a bit of resources that CE can provide. So for career area, we try to provide a 2-month training program where people can actually test out whether charity entrepreneurship is a good fit for them. Do they like working fast? Do they like making decisions under uncertainty? Do they like the aspects that really make charity entrepreneurship a fun and enjoyable career path and something that they can sustain long term? Or is it not a fit for them? It's a heck of a lot easier to test in a 2-month program than to launch your charity and have to let down a co-founder if you leave 6 months later. Similarly, charity idea. Not every fantastic founder is a fantastic researcher. In fact, they kind of inversely correlate. Researchers love the details and going super deep in stuff. A lot of founders like the broad picture. They like being able to get stuff done 90-10 and really accomplish a lot. So we do split them up. We consider hundreds of ideas, slowly narrowing down to more and more rounds of research with more and more depth until we have top 5 ideas, which are really fantastic and have a 50-page research report behind them. That's tough to find otherwise in the charity sector. Similarly with co-founders. We get thousands of applications, and we're able to narrow down again and again through successive rounds, looking at predictive factors of what led to our charities performing in previous rounds, and then come to kind of the top 10 to 15 people who are really a fantastic fit for this. Which means that for someone who goes through the program, they have a pool of ideas that they know are pretty good. They have a pool of founders who they know are pretty good, and who are both interested in the same sorts of things. And finally, country, as you might be able to guess by now, we use an analytical process for that too. Putting them into a spreadsheet, comparing on a bunch of variables, including tractability and whether the person has experience in the country, but also factors like what the prevalence rate is of the disease in that country, what the government has historically said about whether they're going to be able to implement a commitment or this sort of thing. We also try to remove barriers, because starting a charity is really freaking hard, even at the best of times. So the easier we can make it, especially for fantastic charities that might not otherwise get founded, the better. We give some funding, which I think is what a lot of people are most excited about when they hear about charity entrepreneurship. A seed grant that helps you run for the first 12 months, although I think it's a pretty small piece of the overall useful picture. We get them up registered. Again, fairly easy for a bigger institution like us, but being registered from day one as a charitable organization is super convenient. We give mentorship, something that's chronically underrated, but really leads to the difference between really good charities and not. Having 6 months of mentorship with our CE team, who's good at the early stage, and then connecting them later to domain experts who we've talked to while doing the research reports. And finally, community. Doing entrepreneurship can feel like a very lonely path, and charity entrepreneurship is a niche within a niche. But having a group of people who are all pulling in the same direction, all trying to make an impact, can make it feel vastly different. Working in a co-working office where there's other people who are actually in the early stages of founding a nonprofit, talking to someone who's 2 years ahead of you, who just experienced the same problem you're about to go through 6 months from now, is incredibly valuable and gives the charities a real speed boost. So, our cohorts are pretty great. As you might be able to imagine, they're selected from a lot of people who are really enthusiastic about this, and we look at a whole bunch of characteristics. But even within this pretty exciting batch of charity entrepreneurs, this is our most recent batch, there's quite a lot of differentiation between the charity outcomes. And we found that there are some consistent patterns that lead to charities kind of overperforming within CE versus underperforming compared to other CE top charities. So one thing we found is that 2 co-founders is the sweet spot. This isn't a hugely surprising finding because Y Combinator and a lot of other for-profit incubators have found something quite similar. But it turns out solo founding is just really, really hard. even if you have that community, initial seed funding support, et cetera, et cetera. You need someone to bounce ideas off of. You need someone else who's going to put a bunch of hours into the project. You need someone else who cares as much as you do about your specific project. 3 co-founders ends up with too many chefs. A lot of the time you end up with someone who feels like a bit of a third wheel, feels like they're the left out co-founder. So I find that 2 co-founders is a really good way to start off a project. Second thing we've noticed is that feedback loops are super, super important. So a charity that can falsify its work or at least get some really solid evidence of its work doing well or badly in the first 6 months is super valuable. Makes a big difference. It's hard to know how much progress you're making if you're trying to do it blind. And similarly, our charities that have the tightest feedback loops, the quickest plan reevaluation points, and the biggest updates from those plan reevaluations tend to be the ones that overperform 2 or 3 years later. Another factor is getting shit done fast. So there's a temptation to want to kind of find the one true answer, especially in a fairly academic or research-heavy field. But entrepreneurs need to move fast and break things sometimes. They need to get a lot done in general. So we find that even people who can do kind of sprints on a 3-hour project, that tends to correspond out to their charities getting a lot done over a 3-year time period. So this kind of getting stuff done aspect is a really big aspect. And finally, we found that factors tend to multiply, which is kind of an interesting and sometimes a bit of an unfortunate outcome, in that if someone's pretty good at 8 out of the 10 factors that you need to be an entrepreneur, it's actually really tough for them a lot of the time. A single kind of major weakness can make it tough. Your co-founder can balance that out, so it's kind of the weakness of the team instead of the weakness of the individual, but you really have to get a lot of things right to kind of end up being at this fantastic charity stage. Stuff like co-founders, impact focus, feedback loops, etc. Another pattern we've noticed is that great organizations put their time in certain ways. They make certain products or certain outcomes that kind of make sure that they're on track, make sure that they're actually doing what they say they should do. So some of these things are pretty common, and a lot of NGOs do them. Some of them are a little less common and aren't that done in the NGO world. One thing is a needs assessment. Does the problem actually exist? It sounds like an obvious question to ask, but thinking about what the magnitude of the problem is and how concerned people are about it and whether it actually is important to the context that you're working in is surprisingly rarely asked. The next step is a theory of change, a graphical representation of what you're doing and how it eventually leads to impact. And of course, going deeper into that, you can look into the key links of your theory of change and what's the thing that's most likely to bring this down. A surprisingly few number of charities actually know what's the most likely thing that will tank their charity's impact. But it's super important to have this fleshed out in as concrete a way as possible. Speaking of concrete, a process for evaluation and monitoring. You want to be able to actually know whether you're making the progress that you say you're making. You want to actually be able to have a plan for that gap in your theory of change, that part that's low evidence-based. How will you actually get more evidence from that? What are you going to test? Who are you going to ask? What expert are you going to talk to? Or how are you going to gather the data on the ground? Finally, an impact evaluation is really exciting. And I think that the kind of growth of impact evaluation in general in the charity sector is a hugely fantastic movement. And it's something that we're really excited about for our charities. But the more time that an external set of eyes can look at your charity, actually try to assess them from an impact perspective, and have a sense of whether they're doing well or not, the better our charities are. In fact, we've noticed that when we start charities that know that there's an impact evaluator in the area, they tend to perform better. You have good habits, or you build up better habits, if you know that someone's going to be checking them. It's another form of a feedback loop. And finally, a cost effectiveness estimate. You have to have a pretty detailed budget of this. You have to have a pretty detailed theory of change. You have to have a sense of what your actual impact is relative to other actors in the space to really get an accurate cost effectiveness estimate. But at the end of the day, a lot of charities, unfortunately, are competing in a bit of a zero-sum game. If you're starting a charity that's average, you're often pulling funding from another charity that's average. So you really have to make sure that you're one of the field leaders, one of the most cost-effective things, such that even if you pull funding from an average charity, you're still making more net impact for the world. The most predictive factor, though, which I've already touched on, is founders. How many founders apply and how good a fit those founders are is the strongest correlation, the strongest factor we can find to eventually the charities getting super impactfully founded. So the average founder expected value in our models right now is about $350,000 donated to a top charity. So that means if you were doing earning to give and you wanted to donate that amount, that would make it kind of a comparable career path to charity entrepreneurship. But we found that this impact is super spread, as it is in a lot of for-profit founding as well. Our top 1/3 of founders bring almost triple that impact, and it gets even more power a lot as you go up the extremity curve. The top charities really do have absurd levels of impact. And this means it should really be a career path that people are considering, even if their counterfactuals, even if their other job options are very, very strong. Especially if they're a particularly uniquely good fit for charity entrepreneurship, it can be one of the most impactful things that someone can do. A thing that I think we get caught up in or forget about is just how big the problems are of the world and how much scope there is to still work on them. We saw the graph at the beginning of how many charities have been founded, and I think it's easy for people to think, oh, 30 charitable organizations, maybe we've made a major dent in these problems, or maybe there won't be any ideas left, or maybe we've covered the low-hanging fruit. The world is really big. There's tons of hugely pressing issues. We don't think there's going to be an idea shortage. We think there's going to continue to be ideas that, with a strong implementing team, could be fantastically founded. We think that there's funding, especially in the early stage, to get these projects off the ground, pilot, test them, see if they actually work, and then start to prove and compete on the more kind of open charity market. There's still so much impact that can be had for a talented charity founder. Great charities can still be started. There's still a lot of fields that need revolutionized, and there's still tons of lives that are completely missed. Even for areas where a movement has invested a lot of resources, like malaria, there's still gaps. The world is just really big, as are the order of magnitude of problems that we're dealing with. It's not easy. Charity entrepreneurship, a bit like dropping out of uni, isn't for everyone. It's probably not even for a majority of people. But for people who it's a fantastic fit for, why would you settle for anything less than tackling the most important problems of the world head on? It seems like a great way to kind of find purpose, meaning in your life, and make one of the biggest impacts that you possibly can. Charity entrepreneurship has 2 rounds a year for people to apply to see if they want to be a founder. And not everyone who goes through the program ends up founding. But a huge number of people who apply and get into the program say that they hadn't really considered this as a career path. They hadn't thought of themselves as a traditional entrepreneur. So I really do encourage people to maybe take the quiz, see if you score a little bit higher than you'd expect. It might be different characteristics that we tend to look for than what your kind of model of an entrepreneur, especially if your model comes from the for-profit sector, of who might have the most impact. And apply. We try to make the application process simulate a little bit what the experience of making decisions in a charity entrepreneurship setting would be like. So even the application process will give you a bit more of a sense of, is this a career path that might actually be a good fit for me? Is this a career path I want to do with the rest of my life? Thank you. You now have 10 minutes to found a charity, because we finished a bit early. No.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Joey, and sharing your thoughts. We are now open swap questions, so please feel free to drop them in the swap card. Just to open this talk and kind of reflecting on your journey in supporting these and incubating these 30 charities, what are some common features that you've identified throughout the time and years that you think have been important across these charities and how they tackle with global complex issues?
Yeah, it's really interesting because there is, of course, considerable cause area variation. Some cause areas are going to struggle to find talent, some are going to struggle to find funding and this sort of thing. But I do think some of the kind of meta methodologies that we're talking about here end up being really cross-applicable. Feedback loops matter in every cause area. Finding a co-founder who balances out your skill sets matter in every cause area. So I think there's a lot of kind of aspects like that that are maybe a little bit less specific to the idea, but a little bit more broad to the macro process of what people are considering or going through.
Interesting. And another thing I wanted to kind of run by you was for people who might currently be thinking about whether entrepreneurship is a good fit for them or maybe kind of on the edge on evaluating for their personal choices, what are some mechanisms or frameworks you do recommend they could use for a quick self-evaluation?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious one on the slides is the quiz. We do try to build it to test that out. It's really short. It's really simple. It's not that predictive in terms of it's not going to tell you whether you should be an entrepreneur forever, but it will give you a bit of a sign of, oh, these are the sort of questions I like thinking about. These are the sort of questions that might make me dive a little bit deeper. The other thing that comes to mind is we do have a handbook out, as mentioned in the kind of opening, how to start a high impact nonprofit. Going through that, seeing the kind of considerations, questions, content that comes up in that, I think that can give people a really good sense too. Maybe a third thing is talk to other people in the field. So one thing that you'll see with a lot of charity entrepreneurs at this conference and kind of at general conferences like this is they'll have a lanyard that says charity entrepreneurship and ask me about starting a charity. And those are actually the best people to ask, even more so than our staff. The people who went through the program, what considerations did they think about? What did they kind of contemplate through? What kind of pushed them over the edge or made them eventually not found a charity? That sort of thing is super, super useful. And I think our alumni are probably like the best placed people to answer that question. And they're just also great people in general. So good to get in a chat with a fantastic person when you can.
And just building on that, I believe CE also has a tool for kind of getting a better understanding of co-founder dynamics. Is that right? Could you build on that as well?
Yeah. So how we kind of do the co-founder pairing process is you're going through the program, it's a 2-month-long program, and you're kind of simultaneously testing out 3 things. You're testing out an idea, you're testing out kind of practicing a given project, and you're testing out a co-founder fit. So kind of throughout these weeks, you'll be working with co-founder A on idea B and learning a new skill. So say you're making a cost-effect analysis for tobacco taxation with Jim. And you're kind of testing out all those things simultaneously. And then week after week, we kind of both talk to you one-on-one and get you to fill out a form about how is that going? What co-founders did you particularly mesh with? Are those co-founders a good skill set match? And then there's specific activities that kind of break that up too. So part of it is just experience via actually working with someone. It's hard to beat that if you can get that opportunity to kind of practice what it feels like in detail to actually get work done. But another part of it is just finding the pool. It's really hard to find 12 people who are very interested in charity entrepreneurship and a very good fit. So that sort of cycling ends up working well, and you often find someone who's a good personal fit for your kind of founding out of the pool.
Interesting. And often in entrepreneurship, there's this idea of the craziness factor. So sometimes you have individuals who are full of big ideas that are sometimes ahead of their times, and often they end up with a CEO or a co-founder who's more of a practical person. It's like, wait, hold on a minute. No, this is what we can actually do, and this is where you hold the reins. Just interested to hear, what are some other interesting co-founder dynamics that you've seen over the years that you think just work really well as a team?
Yeah, I mean, the classic one, the for-profit thing, is like a technical founder versus a non-technical founder, and this kind of breaks down into like a CEO, COO dynamic. But actually, there's lots of interesting ways that co-founders balance each other out. So often we'll have a co-founder who's a little bit more fast-moving and wants to kind of get things done, and we'll have a co-founder who's a little bit more cautious and thoughtful. Often we'll have a co-founder who's a bit more quantitative, wants to dive into the numbers, the research, really make sure the M&E is right, and we'll have a co-founder that's a bit more communicationally skilled. So they'll be a little bit more on the fundraising, they'll be a little bit more on the presentations, that sort of stuff. Those sort of dynamics are pretty common. What else is common co-founder dynamics? I mean, often people coming from different backgrounds or expertises can be super useful. So we found that like a consultant pairing with a doctor, that tends to work really well. The consultant's used to working fast. They can kind of attend a bunch of stuff. The doctor tends to have a little bit deeper expertise. They bring a really useful credential. Those sort of balances happen quite a lot. Sometimes even people taking slightly different perspectives on at least their baseline intuition as to what the most impactful thing to do is can kind of aggregate out to a thing that's better than the sum of its parts. Another thing that I should mention kind of on the co-founder pairing is I think people will often look at their skill set and go like, okay, I have 5 pieces of the puzzle, and my co-founder might have 5 pieces of the puzzle, but the puzzle's like 30 pieces. How in the heck are we going to kind of implement this project? And although I think it's really useful to have your co-founders balance you out and kind of bring different things to the table, they're not the only person on your team, right? You end up with advisors and board members and staff who also bring stuff kind of to that picture. So you and your co-founder collectively will start by doing everything, but pretty soon you'll also be hiring specialists who are really domain specific or really talented at a given sub area. A lot of what you need your co-founder to balance out is decision making. You and your co-founder collectively need to come to really good decision making, and then be able to somewhat manage the capacity to actually get that decision implemented into the real world, whether that's through management or government partnerships or whatever kind of mechanism that ends up being.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think hopeful this is for anybody who's potentially looking for co-founders at this conference or trying to connect with more individuals here generally. An interesting question we have in the chat is that sometimes people who are good at starting things may not always be the case they're also good at leading things. So do you have a take on that, and maybe what is a good timeline for a founder exit?
Yeah, suspicious trend in the world. Most projects start with 2 co-founders and end up with 1 CEO. So something's got to happen there. And I think that is pretty common. There is definitely an entrepreneurial energy. There's a set of people who are really good, say, years 0 to 3. And then as you're getting bigger, especially once you start getting midline management and you're not kind of having everybody as a direct report or talking to you, then there are different skill sets that come in. Someone who's a little bit steadier set of hands. Someone who's maybe a bit less ambitious, but a bit more rock solid and can just handle any problem as it comes up. So I think that transition often happens kind of, in that, say, 2 to 5 year mark, where you might go from like a 1-person co-founder team to from a 2-person co-founder team to one of the co-founders moving on, founding some other project, one of the co-founders kind of staying on, and then bringing in some kind of more senior level staff to kind of build out their C-level team altogether. But I think that can still be super impactful. I mean, you need to be there for that first couple of years to kind of get it rolling. And although it's not easy to find C-level staff for a top charity, once you're 3 years running, you have a lot more hiring power, you have a lot more network, so you can kind of start to build up those responsible individuals who will kind of help you scale to that next phase.
Thank you for sharing that. Moving a little bit more on sort of the impact evaluation side that you touched on. So a really good question we have from the audience is some organizations or projects just have a very long-termist focus where the impact evaluation might not be as clear-cut. What is your take there and any recommendations you have for what a good feedback loop could look like?
Yeah, every cause area thinks they are uniquely difficult to do measurement and evaluation for. It's always kind of a pain in the ass, and it's always not the funnest thing to do. But I think there are steps and intermediate metrics that you can look at that are a heck of a lot better than not measuring anything. So even if you're looking at something that's, say, a policy project, and you're expecting that the policy to pass will take 5 years or something like this, right? And you won't really have your final win, your final impact until that policy passes, and maybe even then you need to see what actually happens on that policy. So maybe you're looking at a 7-year timeline. What you want to do is map out your theory of change and see how close you can get to that. What are the indicative metrics that you can measure closer? So maybe it's meetings with particular politicians. Maybe it's getting a certain bill on the floor. Maybe it's having a kind of certain level of progress on other kind of intermediate goals, like we have enough signatures to get this here. So I actually think that people maybe let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Can every charity have a full randomized control trial or a dozen that kind of shows that it works in the exact context you're working in? No. Should every charity have a pretty solid M&E plan that's at least, say, 10 pages long on how they would know if they're making progress or not with pretty concrete OKRs and metrics? Yeah, I don't think any cause area is kind of immune to that. So yeah, harder, but ask someone who's worked at ID Insight or ask someone who's worked at GiveWell, you can start to put quantification and measurement and evaluation guidelines on even very, very tough stuff, even very far future or kind of like field building, capacity building type stuff. I mean, charity entrepreneurship is a meta charity, and how you evaluate our impact is you have to look at what the impacts of our charities are and then what's our kind of counterfactual value add to them. But if we just didn't measure the impact of our charities at all, it'd be really hard to know which ones are performing. It'd be really hard to pull out these trends that kind of show, oh, these charities are doing well, even if maybe the exact rankings of the charities will move around 5 years from now.
And just building on that, Joy, have you noticed some interesting frameworks that are maybe being used to measure this impact evaluation in AI safety?
Yeah, AI safety is tough. There's not a charity evaluator in the same way that there is in, say, global health. So I think that people maybe shortcut a bit more often than they should in AI safety in terms of what their kind of intermediate metrics and measurements are. There's a few things that I think are quite specific that could be done there. I mean, you basically want to look at what the world looks like if what you're doing is succeeding and what the world looks like if what you're doing is not. So maybe sometimes that means making very specific forecasts or predictions that are bold and unique and different from what other people in the field who aren't concerned about a given issue would think. Maybe it makes kind of drawing out that theory of change even more important, and you actually need to investigate, like, okay, if I get someone on side with this particular thing, what does that actually lead to? I think what a lot of orgs do, not just in AI, but in a lot of the kind of more meta or abstract spaces, is they kind of like hope that parts of the theory of change will come to be. So I bug research orgs for this a lot. Like, if you do research, your research has to go somewhere. It has to influence something. Research in and of itself in a vacuum is not useful. Research is only useful insofar as it affects a grant-making decision, a charity getting founded, a policy getting passed. So you got to track that down. You got to think about, like, okay, why am I doing this piece of research? What is the actual action that is going to result in that? And I think even asking that question starts to kind of get you in the process. If you have to make a theory of change, you end up seeing, wait a second, I'm doing this thing and I don't even know why. I don't even know how it connects to what I'm actually trying to do at the end of the day. And yeah, you want to spend as little time on that sort of stuff as possible. It gives you more time to spend on the things that actually are going to lead to this disproportionate impact.
Thank you for sharing that. Changing a note a little bit and sort of zooming out on maybe some charities that kind of didn't survive past the incubation period or maybe past their first 2 years once they started growing up and maybe fundraising on their own. Could you share some reflections there on why that might have been the case and any maybe learning lessons for other aspiring founders here in the audience?
Yeah. So one tricky thing is charities fail outright a lot less than the for-profit sector they do. A lot of the time what happens for a charity is they fail to grow and they just kind of limp along in kind of this middling range forever. That's kind of the default thing. So out of the 30 charities, we've only had 3 projects that have kind of like explicitly shut down, don't exist anymore. Out of a batch of 5, I would say often we end up with 2 charities that are fantastic on the way to kind of being field leaders, some of the best in the field. two that are still figuring out their stuff, still kind of maybe limping along, maybe still kind of under plan of evaluation. Sometimes they're too young to evaluate. Out of our 30, about half of those are less than 2 years old. So I'll cut them some slack. They're still figuring out where they're going to be at. And then 1 out of those 5 kind of fails and shuts down altogether. Often it's a combination factor. So often it's stuff like the co-founders don't get along or have too different a vision and they can't get on the same page. That's really devastating for a charity in the first 12 months. It's hard for them to survive that. Funding does end up being the killing blow for a lot of these projects, but often the struggle is there before the funding killing blow happens. So maybe there's a co-founder struggle where they're not working that well together, so they're not making that much progress, and then they go to funders and they show that they're not making that much progress, and then they don't get funding, and then they shut down the org. Was it a funding constraint that shut down the org, or was it that the co-founders weren't compatible? I think often funders are responsive to if a project is making tons of progress. It's rare for a project to be making insane amounts of progress every year and then funding to end up being the kind of killing blow. Sometimes it might be the limiting blow. It might stop an organization from scaling up to kind of what you'd ideally like it to be. But I think a lot of the time that the funding ends up being a response instead of the kind of mechanism.
Building on that funding note and making sure we're building the room and the incentive to pull more talent through the pipeline. What recommendation or strategies would you suggest for grant makers to effectively identify good right talent and to support the most promising nonprofits in the market?
Yeah, really, really good question. And I think it's a thing that a lot of grant makers struggle with. Basically, when you're evaluating something in the late stage, you can look at track record, right? And that's really nice. You have evidence of exactly what the organization is doing, what the cost effectiveness of that is. The earlier you go, the less track record you have. If you're super early, if you're looking at CE charities that started 2 weeks ago, you got 0 track record. So it does move more into people evaluation and plan evaluation. So what makes a plan good? Okay, does it seem plausible? Does it seem feasible? Does it seem realistic? Does the timelines kind of match up with other things I've seen charities able to pull off in that? What makes the people good? Are they talented? Are they, dedicated? Are they going to put in the extra hours and effort that it takes to ultimately get a charity over the finish line? I think these sort of people evaluation is actually both challenging and kind of under-considered as an area for people to get better at. In general, I think people often use what I describe as cheap proxies or vanity metrics on evaluating people. So say, for instance, someone has gone to Harvard. You can assume that they're smart, right? They went to Harvard. Hopefully Harvard had some sort of selection criteria that looked at that. But there's also tons of super smart people who did not go to Harvard. So I think a lot of the time when people are filtering, when grant makers are filtering for early stage projects, they're kind of looking for these credential stamps. They're looking for what's a sign that someone else has done the due diligence and vetted and kind of looked at this such that I can hop on. If you're funding early stage projects, you have to do it. You have to be the first person who kind of hops on and provides the due diligence. And I think that's one of the speed boost things that CE charities get, is that grant makers know that if something has gone through CE, it's gone through a bunch of vetting and process and this sort of thing, such that it's kind of a safer bet in aggregate. And then the kind of alumni community doing well kind of reflects positively back on the charities that are getting founded now, even if they don't have the track record to prove that they're doing well right now. So yeah, people evaluation, I think it's a really good skill for people to get better at, kind of thinking through what actually results in a person being a fantastic fit for a project and executing project well. One of the first things we did with CE is we talked to the founders of the most successful charities in the world. We went and talked to all the founders of the top GiveWell charities. We went and talked to all the founders who were running the top animal charities. We tried to see what are the patterns that we can match out of these people and what is notably absent. They don't all have PhDs in economic development. That's interesting. Maybe you don't actually need that to start a GiveWell recommended charity. Maybe there's something different. They all are super hard workers and they can get a lot done per hour. That's interesting. Maybe we should look for a bit more of that and a bit less of that. And I think as a grant maker, you have to ask yourself the exact same question. Who are the 5 grants that have performed the best in your portfolio, particularly the ones that you were surprised about? And what was different there? What did someone overperform on that maybe your system didn't pick up on or didn't weight as heavily as it should? I could talk about this forever. I love people vetting questions.
At all. That's what we're here for. Touching on that note, Joy, so kind of talking to different grant makers, I think different organizations may have sort of a different ratio preference for how much they believe in the track record of an individual versus the idea they're proposing in, let's say, in a funding application. And there's sort of clear sort of downsides and benefits to both. Do you have a take on what's the healthy ratio, or maybe not so healthy ratio, on how much attention we should give to track record versus the idea that you see in front of you at the time?
Yeah, it's interesting. So earlier stage projects, you just have no track record, so you basically have to take that off the table. I think that when people look at a given cause area, often they'll kind of gravitate towards the biggest actor and just see, okay, who has been doing the space, who has been doing this well out of the 5 people who've been working there. But a lot of the time, the biggest actors kind of come with their own constraints. You know, they'll come with a track record, sure, but they'll also come with a whole bunch of projects that they're doing. And one of them will be really exciting and good, and 5 of them will be kind of mediocre, and it will be hard to kind of earmark for that. So I guess that's one thing when you're kind of comparing a plan to a kind of a broader organization. What's the focus level like? That's one thing that we found had in common with a lot of the top charities. A lot of the top charities in the world are really, really focused. They're not doing 55 different things, doing 2 things excellently. You know, you got to be the best in the world at giving out bed nets to get kind of this top level of impact. So I think looking at the kind of focus and scope of the project, looking at the timelines of how ambitious and how much it is, and also I think scope and kind of sizing the projects appropriately can be a really big factor here too. If you're looking at a brand new project and it's asking for 50K to get started, and you're looking at a really established project and it needs 50 million to keep running for its next year, it's actually a really different bar of rigor, right? You shouldn't be putting in the same amount of hours to those 2 proposals, because you can do a heck of a lot of 50K experiments for $50 million. So I think one thing that maybe unfairly penalizes early stage projects is they're often compared to their later stage counterparts, even though the funding asks are wildly different. You know, if CE did have to commit 10 million over 10 years to a given project, we would need to see a track record. But if it's 100K and we'll get really good results, their measurement and evaluation plan is particularly strong, for example, they have a really clear theory of change, we'll kind of know how they're progressing 6 months out, then that can be worth a bit more of an experimental grant amount. A thing you asked about kind of briefly amongst that is the people versus idea trade-off. And I should be a bit clear on this. Within CE, we find that the people make a really big difference, you know, within the cohort, and the ideas a little bit less so. But these are both super pre-selected communities, right? So this isn't like a random person and a random idea. This is like the top 15 out of 1,000 people and the top 5 out of 200 ideas. So it's like within the best with best, it ends up being people that kind of makes the ideas. But within kind of differentiating out ideas, I still think you have to find ideas that are in that ballpark of the most effective in the world. And in that ballpark with a fairly rigorous kind of set of research. I do think that generally when things are less vetted, they look better. So a cost effectiveness model that I've only put 5 hours into is almost always more optimistic than that same intervention that I put 50 hours into. GiveWell has found this, Rethink Priorities has found this. Things regress when you put more effort and time into it. You find more problems than you find successes. It's not equally distributed, unfortunately. So I think you do need to be a little bit sharp and rigorous, not to maybe take the numbers that a new charity is saying super literally. You know, you want to kind of apply a skepticism or a discount filter for that, but it shouldn't be a discount filter, you know, down to the point where they're not worth an experimental grant.
And building on that, Joy, so it's rare that, like, you know, a successful charity or even a for-profit venture has stayed absolutely true to maybe the first iteration of the problem-solving interventions they started out with. And there's been cases where some founders maybe find it very difficult to iterate from the initial idea because it's their baby that they've been raising for a few years and they're emotionally super close to it, or other reasons. What's your advice or recommendation on how many times, firstly, is it okay to pivot away from your original idea? And then second, when is it okay to maybe think, okay, this just needs an entire reassessment?
Yeah, no more than twice a day. Past that, it really gets confusing and you're rebranding. No, it depends on the scale of the pivot. So I think a lot of the time you want to keep the ends the same. So maybe I'll pick on fish welfare because they were on the slides. You know, if they pivoted from fish to elephants, donkeys, back to fish, that would be really tough. That would be often too big a pivot. They'd lose a lot of the tractability and momentum. If we're talking about implementation strategies of how to help fish, I think there's a lot of room to pivot. You know, often an org will pivot 2 or 3 times in its first 2 years, to kind of find the exact intervention. But some of these pivots are kind of small. Some of these pivots might be, oh, we tried to talk to a bunch of farmers and they just were not interested at all, but we talked to a bunch of government actors and they were super interested. Okay, I guess we're going to pivot to that. Or, you know, we investigated 3 different countries and one of them just seems to be 10 times easier to make progress on, even though on paper, maybe it was the second best country on a spreadsheet. That sort of stuff happens a lot, especially in the first couple of years. And I think, yeah, you want to be, your baby is impact. Your baby is making a difference. That's the thing you really want to be loyal to. And maybe your baby is the broadest form of the idea. But the intervention strategy, you want to hold quite loosely. You want to be able to kind of update based on these feedback loops and evidence and kind of know that, okay, we actually are making traction in this. I would say of our most successful charities, probably half of them had a pretty significant pivot within their first 2 years. But not a pivot to an unrecognizable idea. They didn't have to change their name, but a pivot to the internal strategy such to the point where maybe they had to let go of 2 staff and hire 2 more staff, you know, that sort of thing. Big enough that it actually results in significant organizational change. That happens.
That's really interesting to hear and refreshing too, so thanks for sharing that. Shifting note and touching more sort of the practicalities of running a highly successful organization and a nonprofit. In sort of the first maybe 5 years of an organization, I think maybe in a conventional world, sometimes you can confuse success with the size of your team or like how many people you can put on a payroll, for example. But there's real value in having maybe small, really high execution teams, which has its clear benefits too. Wanted to get your perspective on, in the first sort of 5 years of an organization, what do you think is a good team size, and what are some features of a small but high execution team?
Yeah, it's a really good question and a really big problem in the charity sector. Unfortunately, for someone who hasn't thought about charity at all, maybe comes from the for-profit stuff, or maybe isn't as kind of effective altruism orientated, something like budget and staff size are the 2 obvious things of how successful your charity is. Unfortunately, neither of those connect to impact at all. You know, hopefully they allow you to achieve impact, but you could imagine an organization that has 3 staff that passes an international policy that affects 10 million people. And that might be more effective than another organization that has 55 staff and does a bunch of random things that don't really change anything. So I think it's a bit of a trap that people fall into, where they kind of fall into this thing. CE has a weird habit, actually, where we turn down funding quite a bit. And this isn't like super common in the charity sector. But you actually have to think that funding is the bottleneck, that funding is the marginal thing that is going to allow your organization to get bigger. Or in the case of staff size, you have to think that staff size is the marginal factor that's going to be the most important to work on. And as an exec team, as a co-founder team, your hours are super limited. So it actually is quite a hard trade-off. You know, training up a new staff member as they're onboarding, that comes off against you doing the work directly yourself, you having other connections, you kind of thinking about the strategy a little bit more, sharpening the details on your M&E. So yeah, in terms of what the right charitable size is, varies a lot. Policy charities tend to be smaller, direct delivery charities tend to be bigger. Are you hiring partners who are doing big parts of the work? If so, your kind of staff size on your website might be quite small. If you're hiring all those people yourself under your registered body, then your staff size will be huge. That varies a lot, but I think the real answer is the minimum number that you need to have that impact that you're achieving. And a lot of the time that's probably smaller. I think people maybe hire a bit too slow at the beginning. So I've noticed that our charities are a bit cagey about hiring their first staff or their second staff, and then hire too much at the end. So they kind of get addicted to hiring. It's so convenient, and the kind of hope is, oh, well, if we have twice as many staff, we're going to get twice as much done. Really, really rarely the case that actually scales that way. So yeah, it's definitely an easy thing to get caught up in. In general, the better your M&E is, the more you kind of remember what the heck you're actually aiming towards. And you don't want to spend money. You don't want to burn a bunch of talented staff who could do all sorts of other exciting projects. What you want is the leanest version of what gets the impact done that you need.
And touching on that, Joey, so I feel a lot of the new sort of startups emerging are also working remotely on sort of global complex issues. And sometimes it can just be a little bit harder to not be in the same room together and work on these ideas together and brainstorm. But still, they manage to perform effectively and execute some really amazing things. What are some like qualities or habits you've noticed in those team dynamics that you think just are super valuable to learn for other founders?
Yeah, so First, a note on that, that was actually kind of a surprising finding, that we did find that our co-founders who were remote still could do pretty well. It really helps for them to be tapped into a community if their co-founder's not around though. So, is there a co-working office that's entrepreneurially orientated? Can they come into the CE office? That sort of thing provides this huge benefit. But people have been getting a lot better at it, kind of building up the habits of how do you meet online, how do you kind of spend time together when you're in person in a conference, and then kind of take some of those connectivities and kind of build them out. Some boring things like having more meetings, having more socials, we often recommend our co-founders to have like a designated fun hangout, both when they see each other in person and occasionally online, and that can be really useful. It's maintaining a relationship like any other relationship or friendship. You kind of need to constantly feed positive energy, which can actually be tough for a co-founder relationship, because what are you guys mostly going to talk about? The fires that are going on, the things you most disagree on, and that sort of stuff. So building in some kind of guaranteed positive time, I think, can be really good. Celebrating the victories can be a really obvious thing that people forget to do, but I know definitely a lot of our orgs will, a tiny problem will happen and they'll focus on it for 3 weeks, and then they'll, have some sort of fantastic win, and they'll be like, oh, that's awesome, and then I'll talk to them an hour later and they'll be focusing on something else. It's good to really kind of like pull out and celebrate with your co-founder those wins, and I think that gives you the kind of momentum and energy to keep stuff up. I do think conferences and connective kind of general social events can kind of augment this a lot, even if you're in different contexts. Yeah.
That's really encouraging to hear, and I think as the world is shifting and taking a broader take on this as well. Changing gears to, in our last few minutes, to more of what the future for CE looks like, things you're excited about. Firstly, what do you anticipate sort of the growth of the incubation program going forward, and are there any particular ideas you feel personally excited about?
Yeah, exciting on both fronts. So interestingly, with CE, once we get to this 10 charity kind of amount that are being launched, we need to think about what is the optimal absorbency that the broader philanthropic ecosystem has for new charities. And to me, it's not actually super obvious that it could go up forever. Like if we were starting 100 new charities a year, they'd actually probably cannibalize each other and really struggle. So I don't think we're going to move way up in terms of numbers of charities, but one thing we have been thinking about is kind of expanding horizontally, thinking about other career paths. We just set up a foundation grantmakers training program, for example, and that's been really helpful and really successful, and kind of coming at it from another angle in terms of there are grantmakers who, a lot like charity founders, are kind of setting up a grant-making organization and would love to learn how to set up a really good measurement and evaluation system for early-stage projects, for example, and we can kind of help them kind of describe that. So that's a new and exciting thing happening with charity entrepreneurship. In terms of upcoming ideas, I mean, the very new upcoming round is we're focusing on biorisk, which is a new area for us, so not something we've launched a bunch of charities in before, so that's very exciting. The first couple charities in the area actually provide us a lot of information, because we can see, does that area seem tractable? What are the kind of co-founders that ended up succeeding in that area, and that sort of thing. So that will always be super interesting when we're doing a new cause area. And then we're doing another couple kind of like classic global health and policy-oriented organizations. So there's a idea that we have on our list about road traffic safety, which reminds me a lot of lead elimination. It's just so obvious and so beneficial, and there's really not that much opposition. It's just kind of a matter of kind of getting it on the table and having the right conversations, and then there's opportunity to save a whole ton of lives. So that's very exciting. I've talked about aquatic animals quite a bit, but there's a lot of fish in the world. There's a lot of shrimp in the world. I think there's stuff like that. We do have some more kind of fish-oriented ideas. I think on the animal side, people maybe imagine fish to be this like homogenized group, but they're actually so different that you could have a fish charity that focuses exclusively on carp and another one that focuses exclusively on salmon, and they'd almost have no overlap in terms of what they do. So that's a kind of exciting area that we're going to continue to investigate. But yeah, in general, CE's always trying to think about the broad ecosystem. What are the kind of components or the gaps that will stop our charities from succeeding? And right now, the two fundamental gaps that are most likely to come up are founders at the very beginning, especially to kind of top fit founders. And then we're a little bit worried about mid-stage funding. So post-seed grant, after we do that, what kind of happens to charities in the 2 to 5 year range, where maybe they're too small for someone like GiveWell to consider, but they're big enough to be kind of have outgrown our seed network. So that's part of the area we're working on. We've set up some funding circles, for example, like a mental health funding circle, and this has really helped this kind of like midline funding piece. So that's another thing that we're kind of thinking about, contemplating putting more time into.
Yeah, I think that'd be super significant to see this sort of like intermediate death valley of funding where you're not too big but not too small, but still doing important work. So yeah, like excited to see that coming out. Another question we have from the audience is, so in contrast to the current incubation program, would there be any plans in the future for potentially a part-time program where people are working full-time already and maybe can't commit to the incubation program could still be a part?
Sounds really appealing in some ways, but starting a charity is on the edge of impossible already. It's very, very tough. We've had some success with a part-time founder if there's maybe 2 full-time founders and they're like a 0.5 on top of that. So it's like 2.5 net co-founder teams. But man, it's hard for projects to make progress. We've actually had people apply for our program who are fantastic founders, really good idea, but they can't go full time on it, and typically we reject those people. Typically we say, you got to take the dive, and maybe that means working full time in something else for a year and then trying charity entrepreneurship for a year, but it's more than a full-time job most of the time.
Well put. Yeah, like interested to hear your thoughts on potentially people, just building on that, who might not be able to be part of in particular the CE incubation program, but still excited to start a charity or a for-profit that's also doing important work. What are your thoughts or recommendations there on how people would best utilize their time going forward?
Yeah, so I'm really quite bullish on for-profit entrepreneurship. I think it builds a lot of skills that you need for nonprofit entrepreneurship. The funding mechanisms are slightly different and the measurement and evaluation mechanisms are slightly different, but a lot of the people management and project management and those sort of skill sets overlap. I also think that's one of the ways to solve the midline ecosystem thing, is to have talented entrepreneurs who end up kind of doing earning to give or signing the founder's pledge or some sort of equivalent like that, making a difference. So that's something I like everyone having on the radar. The other thing is working with an early stage charity that is doing a really good job and you can kind of pick up the habits from. So maybe you don't want to found a charity right now, or maybe you're part-time, for example, whatever the case may be. If you pick up the habits from a charity with, say, sub 10 staff, but who are accelerating, that will really well train you up for long-term entrepreneurship.
And building on that as well, Joy, in terms of like things that you're excited to see in sort of a month, as sort of maybe a closing remark for the audience as well. What do you think are personally some of the most important challenges you'll be solving for other charities incubator or other charities coming through in the pipeline in the next month or two that you'll be investing a lot of your personal time in?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to pick favorites, as Carolina mentioned at the opening talk. A lot of the charities are doing really well, but we definitely think in this tiers of impact, kind of finding a wider range of charities that are really promising from plausible epistemic and ethical perspectives. So, I like some of the work that's been going on in mental health. I like some of the work that's been going on in the animal space. We try to kind of balance out our classic cause areas, farm animals and global poverty, with some of these new experimental areas, mental health, biorisk, family planning, that sort of thing. So I kind of continue to be excited about the growth of cause X, or kind of new areas that maybe are underexplored by people or underconsidered by people, but actually do look equally impactful depending on your kind of like ethical and epistemic trade-offs.
Perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. Joey is doing office hours right after the sessions in Quayside 2, so please feel free to come up to him and ask any more questions you have. But yeah, like I think from the EA community, we're really lucky to have you leading this work and excited to see what comes in the pipeline. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time.